The most disturbing thing about Jeffrey Epstein is not only the crimes he committed, it is not only the wealth he accumulated or the powerful rooms he entered. The most disturbing thing is what his story revealed about us, about our systems, our institutions, and the dangerous comfort of looking the other way. Now, I want to speak plainly, because when something shakes the conscience of a nation, we don't whisper about it, we confront it. What disturbed so many Americans was the idea that power could insulate someone from accountability. That influence could blur lines, that connections could delay consequences. And when everyday people look at that and wonder whether there is one set of rules for the powerful and another for everyone else, that's when trust begins to erode. And trust is the foundation of democracy. Power without accountability is dangerous. It always has been. And when we pretend otherwise, when we convince ourselves that influence somehow equals integrity, we allow something corrosive to take root in our democracy. What troubled so many Americans in this story was not just the wrongdoing itself, but the perception that the rules seemed flexible for the well-connected, that access could soften consequences, that wealth could purchase time, doubt, or even silence. And when people begin to believe that accountability depends on your status instead of your actions, something fundamental begins to fracture. The rule of law is not an abstract idea. It is a promise. A promise that no matter who you are, no matter how powerful your friends, how impressive your resume, or how expansive your resources, you are subject to the same standards as everyone else. That promise is what separates democracy from corruption. It is what distinguishes justice from privilege. And when that promise appears compromised, people don't just lose faith in a case. They lose faith in the system. Let's be honest about what power does. Power opens doors. It builds networks. It creates layers of insulation. It can intimidate. It can persuade. It can delay. And without strong guardrails, without vigilant oversight, power can begin to believe it is untouchable. History teaches us this lesson over and over again, not just in one scandal or one individual, but across generations and across governments. When institutions grow too comfortable with influence, when watchdogs hesitate, when scrutiny is uneven, accountability weakens. And when accountability weakens, abuse finds room to grow. This is not about tearing down institutions, it is about strengthening them. Because the answer to institutional failure is not abandonment, it is reform. It is ensuring that prosecutors are independent, that investigations are thorough, that conflicts of interest are exposed, not buried, that transparency is the rule, not the exception. Accountability must be structural, not optional. And here's why this matters so deeply. When ordinary Americans see powerful individuals seemingly escape consequences, it doesn't just anger them, it discourages them. It tells the single parent working 2 jobs that fairness might be a myth. It tells the small business owner who follows every regulation that integrity may not be rewarded. It tells young people watching from the sidelines that success might be more about connections than character. We cannot allow that message to stand. Because democracy depends on shared belief that laws apply equally, belief that justice is impartial, belief that no one is above scrutiny. Once that belief erodes, cynicism rushes in to replace it, and cynicism is dangerous. It disengages voters. It weakens civic participation. It creates space for extremism and distrust. But here's what I know about this country. When Americans recognize injustice, they do not stay silent forever. They organize, they demand answers, they push for change. Power without accountability is dangerous. But power checked by transparency is transformative. It means clear reporting requirements. It means empowering inspectors general and protecting whistleblowers who are brave enough to come forward. It means ensuring that settlements, plea agreements, and legal decisions withstand public scrutiny rather than crumble under it. It also means cultural change, because accountability is not just legal, it is moral. It requires leaders in every sector, business, government, media, to ask not just, is this permissible, but is this right? The bare minimum of legality is not the same as ethical responsibility. And when those in positions of influence understand that scrutiny is not persecution, but protection, the system works better for everyone. Let's remember, accountability is not about vengeance. It is not about vengeance. It is not about spectacle. It is about fairness. It is about reaffirming that the scales of justice are not tipped by wealth or status. If we want young people to believe in public service, if we want communities to trust law enforcement, if we want voters to participate with confidence, then accountability must be visible and consistent. The danger is not only in one person's abuse of power, the danger is in the normalization of imbalance. When exceptions quietly become expectations, that is why we must be vigilant. That is why oversight matters. That is why transparency matters, because unchecked power does not remain contained. It expands, it influences policy, it shapes culture, it redefines norms, and the longer it goes unchallenged, the harder it becomes to correct. But correction is possible. Reform is possible. Renewal is possible. Democracies are resilient when their citizens insist on eigenness. So let us insist. Let us demand systems strong enough to withstand influence, leaders courageous enough to enforce standards, and institutions committed enough to earn back trust when trust has been shaken. Because power without accountability is dangerous, and accountability without exception is the foundation of justice. And then there is the silence. The silence is often more disturbing than the headline, because silence is not passive. Silence protects, silence protects, silence protects, silence protects. Silence allows harm to continue long after the first warning signs appear. In situations like this, we often ask, how could this have happened? How could so many people not know? But the harder question, the more honest question, is this: who suspected and said nothing? Who saw something unusual, troubling, inappropriate, and chose comfort over courage? Silence thrives in environments where power is concentrated. When someone is wealthy, connected, or influential, people hesitate. They second-guess their instincts. They worry about consequences. They tell themselves it's not their place. They convince themselves that someone else will step in. But too often, no one does, and that is how silence becomes a shield for abuse. We have seen this pattern before across industries and institutions. It starts with whispers, with rumors, with small red flags dismissed as misunderstandings. Then comes rationalization. It can't be that bad. There must be more to the story. Surely someone in authority is handling it, and in that space between suspicion and action, harm grows. Silence isolates the vulnerable. It makes survivors question their own experiences. It reinforces fear. When someone comes forward and feels dismissed or ignored, the message they receive is devastating. Your pain is less important than someone else's reputation. That is not who we should be, because courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else matters more. It is the choice to speak when it would be easier to stay quiet. It is the understanding that protecting the vulnerable outweighs protecting proximity to power. Let's be clear, breaking silence is not easy. It can mean professional risk, social consequences, personal attacks. It can mean standing alone in rooms where others avoid eye contact. But progress in this country has always depended on people willing to endure discomfort in pursuit of justice. When survivors speak up, they are not seeking attention. They are seeking acknowledgement. When whistleblowers step forward, they are not trying to create chaos. They are trying to restore integrity. And institutions must create environments where those voices are not punished, but protected. That means clear reporting channels. It means independent review processes. It means leadership that responds swiftly and transparently when allegations surface. It means shifting the culture from one that protects prestige to one that prioritizes people. Silence is often justified in the name of stability. Leaders worry about reputational damage. Organizations fear legal exposure. Communities resist scandal. But the cost of silence is always greater than the cost of truth. Because silence compounds harm. It allows patterns to continue unchecked. It sends a signal to perpetrators that influence is stronger than accountability, and it tells survivors that speaking up may change nothing. We cannot accept that. We must build systems where the first warning sign triggers inquiry, not denial, where concerns are investigated, not buried, where power does not intimidate oversight. It is cultural. Each of us must examine the ways we respond when we hear something troubling. Do we lean in and ask questions? Or do we lean back and hope it fades away? It is easy to condemn silence in hindsight. It is harder to challenge it in real time. But that is where integrity lives. In real time, integrity is choosing transparency over convenience. It is refusing to laugh off behavior that feels wrong. It is resisting the instinct to protect access at the expense of ethics. The whisper becomes a report. The report becomes an investigation. The investigation becomes accountability. This is how we honor survivors, not with performative outrage, but with structural change. Not with temporary attention, but with lasting protection. Not with sympathy alone, but with systems that prevent repetition. But so is voice. When we create spaces where speaking up is supported, when we teach young people that integrity matters more than influence, when we show that truth is stronger than status, we chip away at the culture that allowed harm to flourish. We cannot undo what was done, but we can refuse to allow silence to write the next chapter. Because the moment we decide that protecting people matters more than protecting power, the silence begins to break. And when the silence breaks, justice has a chance to speak. And at the center of all of this, beyond the headlines, beyond the speculation, beyond the powerful names and institutions, are the survivors. If we are going to talk about justice, then we have to be very clear about who justice is for. It is not for the commentators. It is not for political advantage. It is not for public spectacle. Justice is for the people whose lives were altered, whose trust was violated, whose safety was taken from them. Too often, in cases involving wealth and influence, the focus drifts upward toward the powerful, toward the sensational details, toward the intra-ig. But real moral clarity requires that we focus downward and inward toward those who endured harm. Justice for survivors must be non-negotiable, not conditional on status, not deleted by reputation. When someone survives exploitation or abuse, the trauma does not end when the story fades from the news cycle. It lives in memory. It affects relationships, careers, mental health, and self-worth. And when the system moves slowly or appears reluctant, survivors relive that harm through frustration and doubt. We must understand that accountability is not only about punishment, it is about acknowledgement. It is about validation. It is about restoring a sense of agency to people who were stripped of it. And that begins with listening. Listening without defensive. Listening without skepticism as a default. Listening without prioritizing the comfort of the accused over the courage of the accused over the courage of the accused. For generations, survivors were told to stay quiet. They were warned that speaking up would ruin their futures. They were asked what they were wearing, where they were standing, why they didn't leave sooner. The burden of proof was placed not just on facts, but on their character. That culture must end. Believing survivors does not mean abandoning due process. It means taking allegations seriously. It means investigating thoroughly. It means ensuring that the justice system operates with both fairness and urgency. Because delays can feel like denial, silence can feel like dismissal, and indifference can feel like betrayal. We must also acknowledge that justice looks different for different people. For some, it means legal consequences. For others, it means public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. For many, it means systemic change that prevents others from experiencing what they did. And that is why survivor-centered reform matters. It means trauma-informed, ed practices in law enforcement and courts. It means access to counseling and support services. It means statutes of limitations that reflect the reality that trauma often delays reporting. It means financial restitution when appropriate. It means protecting privacy and dignity throughout the process. Justice cannot re-traumatize the very people it claims to defend. When systems are designed without survivors in mind, they often compound harm. Intimidating procedures, public scrutiny, endless delays. These barriers discourage reporting and reinforce silence. If we truly believe that no one is above the law, then we must also believe that no survivor is beneath its protection. And let's remember something essential. Seeking justice is not about revenge. It is about balance. It is about affirming that harm has consequences and that dignity matters. Extraordinary strength. But survivors should not have to rely on personal resilience alone. They deserve institutional strength standing beside them. They deserve communities that support them, leaders who defend them, laws that protect them, and systems that act swiftly and fairly. When survivors see accountability carried out with seriousness and respect, it sends a powerful message, not only to them, but to others watching. It says you are not invisible. Your voice matters. Your experience counts. And it sends another message as well to those who might abuse power, that influence will not shield misconduct. That is how trust is rebuilt, not through rhetoric, not through outrage alone, but through consistent, visible commitment to fairness. We cannot rewrite the past, but we can shape the future. We can strengthen protections. We can improve processes. We can remove barriers. We can ensure that justice does not depend on courage alone, but is supported by structure, because courage should be honored, not required as a condition for dignity. At the heart of democracy is a simple principle. Every person has equal worth. When survivors are ignored or sidelined, that principle weakens. When they are heard, respected, and protected, that principle strengthens. And if we are serious about accountability, if we are serious about reform, if we are serious about restoring trust, then we must start and end with those who were harmed. Justice for survivors must never be optional. It must be the standard by which we measure ourselves. If we are honest with ourselves, we know that outrage alone is not enough. Anger may awaken us, but it cannot sustain change. If we truly want accountability to mean something, if we want silence to lose its grip and survivors to see real justice, then institutional reform is not optional. It is a moral obligation. Because institutions are not abstract buildings or distant bureaucracies, they are the frameworks that shape how power operates. They determine whether transparency is routine or rare, whether oversight is independent or influenced, whether justice moves swiftly or stalls behind closed doors. When systems fail, we have two choices. We can treat the failure as an anomaly and move on, or we can treat it as a warning and rebuild stronger. Reform is not about assigning blame for its own sake. It is about correcting vulnerabilities. It is about identifying where influence may have distorted judgment, where procedures allowed discretion without oversight, where accountability mechanisms were too weak to withstand pressure. That means strengthening ethics laws so that conflicts of interest are disclosed clearly and early. It means ensuring that prosecutorial decisions, especially in cases involving wealth and influence, are subject to transparent review. It means making sure that settlements and agreements cannot be quietly negotiated in ways that deny victims their voice. Transparency should never depend on public outrage. It should be embedded in the process itself. And let's talk about oversight. Independent oversight is not a nuisance to those in power. It is protection for the integrity of the system. Inspectors general, watchdog agencies, ethics committees, these structures exist to ensure that power is exercised responsibly. When they are underfunded, undermined, or ignored, the system weakens. We must ensure they are empowered, not sidelined. Reform also requires clarity. Laws that are ambiguous invite exploitation. Regulations that lack enforcement mechanisms invite evasion. Accountability must be codified in ways that leave little room for manipulation. But institutional reform is not only legal, it is cultural. Leaders set the tone. When those at the top treat ethics as secondary, the message cascades downward. When they treat compliance as a box to check rather than a principle to uphold, corners are cut. And when reputation is valued more than responsibility, problems are concealed rather than corrected. A culture of integrity must be intentional. That means training that emphasizes ethical responsibility. It means leadership that models transparency. It means consequences for misconduct that are consistent, regardless of rank or relationship. It also means protecting those who speak up. Whistleblowers should not be isolated or retaliated against. They should be safeguarded by clear laws and supported by institutional structures that recognize their role in strengthening accountability. Because reform without protection is fragile, we should also recognize that reform is not a one-time act, it is ongoing. Systems evolve, power adapts, new vulnerabilities emerge. Oversight must be continuous, not reactive. Democracy demands maintenance. Some will argue that reform is costly, that investigation, NS, take time, that stronger regulations create inconvenience. But the cost of neglect is always greater. When trust erodes, when citizens begin to believe that fairness is selective. The social fabric phrase, trust is hard to earn and easy to lose. Institutional reform is how we earn it back. It is how we demonstrate that lessons have been learned, that weaknesses have been addressed. That harm will not be repeated simply because attention has shifted. Reform sends a message to survivors that their experiences led to meaningful change. It sends a message to the public that accountability is more than rhetoric. And it sends a message to those who might consider abusing power that the system is watching and that it will act. But reform requires political will. It requires bipartisan commitment. It requires resisting the temptation to treat oversight as partisan or investigations as political weapons. Accountability must be above politics if it is to restore confidence. We cannot strengthen institutions selectively. We cannot demand transparency only when it suits us. Reform must be consistent, or it becomes another tool of division. The goal is resilience. A resilient system can withstand scrutiny. It can endure criticism. It can correct its own failures. It does not fear transparency because it relies on it. And when institutions are resilient, democracy becomes stronger. This is how we move forward, not by dwelling solely on what went wrong, but by committing to what must be made right. Not by dismantling faith in our systems, but by reinforcing them with clearer rules, stronger oversight, and deeper integrity. Because institutions are only as trustworthy as the standards they uphold. And reform is how we prove that those standards matter. And after we have confronted the danger of unchecked power, after we have broken the silence, after we have centered survivors and committed ourselves to reform, there is one final truth we must hold on to. Courage is contagious. It always has been. Change does not begin with institutions. It begins with individuals. One person deciding that something is wrong. One voice refusing to be quiet. One act of integrity in a moment when compromise would be easier. We often imagine courage as something grand and dramatic, but more often it is quiet. It is a staff member raising a concern, a journalist asking one more question, a voter demanding transparency, a colleague refusing to dismiss troubling behavior. Courage begins in small decisions, repeated consistently. And when others see that courage, something remarkable happens. It spreads. That is how movements are born. That is how accountability becomes expectation rather than exception. That is how cultures shift. When someone steps forward and tells the truth, it gives others permission to do the same. When one institution commits to transparency, it pressures others to follow. When leaders choose ethics over expediency, it redefines what leadership looks like. Courage disrupts complacency. There will always be voices that say change is too difficult, that the system is too entrenched, that power protects itself. But history tells a different story. History tells us that determined citizens, acting together, have repeatedly reshaped institutions that once seemed immovable. Progress has never been automatic. It has always been demanded, and the demand begins with people who believe that fairness matters more than fear. It takes courage for survivors to speak. It takes courage for investigators to pursue truth despite pressure. It takes courage for lawmakers to strengthen oversight even when it inconveniences their allies. It takes courage for citizens to stay engaged when cynicism would be easier. But here is what we must remember. Courage does not operate in isolation. It creates momentum. When communities support those who speak up, they reduce the cost of truth. When voters reward transparency, they incentivize integrity. When institutions demonstrate accountability, they reinforce public trust. Each act builds on the last, and slowly, what once felt exceptional becomes expected. We should not underestimate the power of expectation. When society expects accountability, leaders adapt. When the public demands transparency, secrecy becomes harder to maintain. When courage becomes normalized, silence loses its strength. This is how democracies renew themselves, not through perfection, but through participation. It is easy to feel discouraged when confronted with stories of abuse and institutional failure. Easy to wonder whether real change is possible. But resignation has never built a better system. Engagement has. Every reform we discussed began with people who refused to accept the status quo. Every protection now embedded in law was once an idea that faced resistance. Every improvement in oversight was once dismissed as unnecessary. Courage turned those ideas into reality. And we need that courage now. not only from leaders, but from citizens, from educators teaching ethics, from journalists pursuing facts, from voters demanding answers, from young people insisting that the future be fairer than the past. Democracy is not sustained by outrage alone. It is sustained by sustained effort, by people who show up, by people who pay attention, by people who hold institutions accountable not just once, but consistently. Courage is not loud for a day and silent the next. It is persistent. It means voting even when disillusioned. It means advocating even when progress feels slow. It means asking difficult questions even when the answers are uncomfortable. And when enough people commit to that persistence, something shifts. The culture changes, the expectations rise, the standards strengthen. That is how trust is rebuilt, not through declarations, but through demonstrated integrity over time. We cannot control every failure. We cannot prevent every abuse of power, but we can control how we respond. We can choose engagement over apathy. We can choose transparency over secrecy. We can choose courage over silence. And when we do, we send a clear message. Accountability is not optional. Justice is not selective. Democracy is not passive. It lives in the actions of people who care enough to defend it. Courage is contagious. And when we choose it together, it becomes unstoppable.